Okay, Fred, I changed my mind. I want to do that video at the start. So we're going to watch a video to kick off tonight that has, nothing to do specifically with numbers, but it's about interpreting an interpretation of biblical narrative. It's actually a 4-part series, and we're going to watch 4 parts. Well, it's actually like a 12-part series, but there's 4 parts of the series on narrative, and we're going to watch those 4 parts over the next few weeks. So we'll watch a video to kick us off on biblical narrative and sort of how do we understand, interpret hermeneutically, how do we approach biblical narrative. So enjoy.
We're learning how to read different types of literature in the Bible. And we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting. But then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved and the character finds herself changed, living in a new norm.
Now, when reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plot line. You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take for example the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God doesn't.
Now, if you look at the scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point, because it's ignoring the larger plot line.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning. You'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if he'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is, when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
We have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark, while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, so short scenes, like Gideon and the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements, and And then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plot line of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus. Hey guys.
Hey guys. So, there you go, plot and narrative. We're looking at Numbers right now, which is the reason why I kind of put this video here, because we recently exited our study of Leviticus, where we read legal codes and, law is law, and you interpret law differently than you interpret narrative. And so reading narrative now, I kind of wanted to, I just want us to think about what is narrative, how do we understand narrative, how is it different than law, how is it different than prophecy, how do you read Numbers differently than Isaiah or than Leviticus or even than Genesis. Just kind of throw those questions in the back of your mind and think about the biblical story, think about the framework of Scripture and how all these things fit together, because I like the big picture. I don't like to get lost in the details, although that's sort of what we're here to do. So, let's get lost in some details, huh? So, Numbers 14 is where we're picking up tonight. Where did we leave off last week? Do you remember?
We are grasshoppers.
Yeah, you remember those guys? The Nephilim. That's where we left off last week. Talking about Nephilim. There are giants in the land, and who did those giants come from? They came from this person who we know nothing about. His name is Anak. This is one of the first times that he's mentioned in Scripture, and we don't know anything about him except that he somehow was in this lineage through which the Nephilim were reintroduced into the world after the flood. You had Nephilim before the flood in Genesis 6, and now we have Nephilim after the flood in Numbers 13. Somehow they got back, and we're looking at Anak. And of course, we've studied Nimrod, we've looked at all of that. So, okay. The people at this point are terrified because of the bad report that the 10 spies brought back. That's where we pick up the story. And what does the congregation do as a result of this bad report? The whole congregation, in chapter 14, they raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. So, Joshua and Caleb must have just felt terrible because they brought back a good report, and the result is that the people spent the whole night in their tents weeping. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is Yahweh bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Okay, so right now, their plan is essentially to stage a coup against Moses. They're going to appoint a new leader, and that leader is going to lead them back to the place where they were in bondage and slavery for 400 years. It's a great plan, right? Okay. And then, Moses and Aaron, they fall on their faces, and Joshua and Caleb, who spied out the land, they say, "The land which we passed through to spy it out is exceedingly good. If Yahweh delights in us, He'll bring us into the land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against Yahweh, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. We're going to devour them. They're going to be our food. Their protection is removed from them, and Yahweh is with us. Do not fear them." And what's the people's response? Those guys who are telling us to not fear the inhabitants of the land, let's go ahead and stone them. Yeah. We're going to go ahead and kill them. But the glory, the kavod, the weight of Yahweh appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel. And Yahweh said to Moses, "How long will this people despise me, and how long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs that I have done among them?" Remember, this is the generation who came out of Egypt in the Exodus, right? So he says, I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. And the question is, where have we seen that before?
Well, sounds like Abram.
I hear an Abram and a Noah.
No, it was
Just
when,
12.
when Moses interceded for the Israelites before, when the Lord relented and said, okay,
Yeah,
I will not.
gold star. Moses and, not Moses, Abram and Noah, great answers. But the answer I was going for was Exodus 32, because remember that the Torah is a chiasm. And the chiasm of Leviticus goes to the Day of Atonement, and Numbers and Exodus sit opposite each other. And so the stories in Numbers are ordered in such a way that they're going to parallel and mirror the stories in Exodus. So when we come to something like this, which is God saying, I'm going to strike down the nation, and Moses, I'm going to take you and turn you into a new nation, that is exactly the same thing that God said to Moses in Exodus 32 when the people were worshiping the golden calf. Okay, everyone with us? We good? We're all moving together? Okay, what does Moses do? He intercedes. Yeah, just look at it's not inspired, but just look at the title of the next section. Moses intercedes for the people. So, still chiastic to Exodus 32, right? Because Moses intercedes for the people, and that's where God relents, is through Moses' intercession. And we had a big discussion the week that we studied Exodus 32 in our little email chain about whether or not God changes his mind, and there's that whole discussion wrapped around that. But here we are on the other end, the Numbers side of Moses' intercession. So, Moses said to Yahweh, the Egyptians will hear of it. Now, what was his argument to Yahweh in Exodus 32?
The other nations will see that he's a horrible God.
Yeah. And that you saved your people out of Egypt just to kill them in the wilderness. Well, here's what he says here. The Egyptians will hear of it, for you brought up this people in your might from among them, and they will tell all the inhabitants of this land, talking about Canaan, they have heard that you, O Yahweh, are in the midst of this people, for you, O Yahweh, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. And if you kill this people as one man, then the nations who have heard your fame will say, it is because Yahweh was not able to bring this people in the land that he swore to give them, that he has killed them in the wilderness. So, just mark my place here because this is important. I don't want to skip anything. So Moses is bringing an argument to God based on what? His glory, okay. Okay. His name. You said reputation. Okay. I'm going to go with name and reputation. And the reason why I want to go with name and reputation is to tie in. Well, first off, I want to tie this to Exodus 32 because that's the natural chiastic structure. But I want to tie this all the way back to the theme of the name in Genesis 11 and Genesis 12. Remember Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, the people making a name for themselves. Genesis 12, he says to Abram, I'm going to make a name for you. And the difference between those two things. So it is your reputation, but remember what else is going on. We've talked about this a number of times. What else is going on in the law? Is the law just about Israel? It's about all the nations, right? There is an evangelistic tone all throughout the Torah, and who is going to say these bad things about Yahweh if he kills the people? Egypt is. But what was going on in the plagues in Exodus, 6 through 12, 7 through 12, whatever the plagues were? He says repeatedly, so that Pharaoh and so that the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. Right? And so Moses is coming to God with the argument that if you do this, you are going to undo all of the work that you did through the plagues. You're going to undo the fact that you saved Israel at the golden calf incident at Sinai. And your reputation and your fame is going to be worthless. Instead of having a great name among the nations, they're going to put down the name of Yahweh, saying that he was unable to save this people. Right? Okay. So he says in verse 17, and now, please let the power of Adonai be great, as you have promised, saying, Yahweh is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. What did he just quote? He just quoted God from what book and chapter? Exodus 34. So our chiastic structure is continuing. We're having this Exodus 32 through 34. We're calling our minds back to the golden calf incident and God revealing himself in the cleft of the rock on Sinai to Moses. And this was the name that he gave. And so they finished by saying, please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. And what does God do? Does he forgive them?
Kind of. Some of them.
Kind of, some of them, okay. It's not inspired, but what's the title of the next section say? God promises judgment. Okay. So, Yahweh says, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly, as I live and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of Yahweh, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. So, are they forgiven? Sort of, kind of. Because God doesn't kill them, just like he doesn't kill them in Exodus 32, but there is a punishment. And that punishment is that, I don't think we're there yet. I think that's the next chapter. No, that's 30. Where am I at? I lost my place. Okay, here we are, verse 30. Here's the punishment. Not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb and Joshua, the 2 spies who brought back the good report. But your little ones, who you said would become prey, I will bring them in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness, according to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, so 1 year for each day that they were in the promised land. That's how long they're going to be wandering in the desert. And here's the cool thing about narrative. There's a lot going on in here, and it's kind of really easy to teach because you've read it, and unless you weren't reading carefully at all, I don't really have to say much about it because it's a story, and we're used to reading stories. But we're not really used to reading stories in a Hebrew way, and that's why we're here. But narrative is cool, because I don't really have to do much. So, what do the people do? God says, you can't go into the land, your children will go into the land, but you're going to wander in the wilderness. What does Israel do?
Oh, we better go into the land now.
Okay, so where were they trying to go before?
Egypt.
They were going to go back to Egypt and appoint a new leader. And as soon as God said, you can't go into the land, they reject their first plan to go back to Egypt and decide they're going to go into the land. It's like a rebellious 4-year-old who's like, anything that you say they can't have is the thing they're going to do everything in their power to
Boss
get.
of me.
So they try to go back into the land, and what happens? The Amalekites and the Canaanites, they kill a bunch of people. They came down and defeated them and pursued them, even to Hormah. So, whoops, I clicked on the wrong thing. So all the people who were there, who tried to go in, they were defeated. Sorry, I clicked in a bad spot and lost my place. So,
I have a question.
yeah, go ahead.
So, in verse 36, it talks about, or in 37,
Mhm.
those men that brought the evil report died by the plague of the Lord. So who are the ones that, if they died by the plague of the Lord, who are the ones that chose to go into the land anyway, and then, were killed by it?
Other people. I don't.
Oh, because he didn't send everybody into spies. You're right. Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yep. Cool. So those 10 were killed by a plague.
Okay, yes.
Okay, good. Now, okay, so they go in. Remember, we're reading narrative right now. They go in, and they get defeated, and they get sent back out. Okay. What's the next section about? laws about sacrifices. So the narrative comes to a screeching halt, and we dive back into legal code. Why?
Because they broke the law.
Because they broke the law. Well, check this out. Okay, so Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that you are to inhabit, which I'm giving you, and you offer to Yahweh from the herd or from the flock, a food offering or a burnt offering or a sacrifice to fulfill a vow or as a freewill offering at your appointed feast to make a pleasing aroma, a noach ruach." We studied that to Yahweh. "When he who brings his offering shall offer to Yahweh a grain offering, a tenth of an ephah of fine flour." And he goes on and gives all these legal codes that we don't really, we've studied this. This is repetition for us.
What's a parallel in Exodus?
It's a parallel to Exodus instead of Leviticus. So, why take a section? If you are assembling a story, why would you take a section from somewhere else and almost copy and paste it again later?
It's kind of like a
Complete my
flashback,
time.
right?
It's kind of like a flashback. It's sort of a chiasm, but it's to Leviticus instead of to Exodus. So it sort of breaks the chiastic structure.
Well, do you think it's like a literary picture? Like, since they broke the law, he is now assembling your story in kind of like a picture as to remind them, to reestablishing, yeah, and remind.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think so?
Encouragement,
Could be encouragement.
in the sense that, yes, all this bad stuff just happened, but when you come into the land,
Mm-hmm.
then don't forget, these are my rules. In other words, I haven't taken that away.
Okay, so who was the narrative just dealing with? The first generation or the second generation?
Now it skips to the
Who's
second.
going into the land?
Second.
Okay, so all of the people who were getting the law at Sinai, now I'm assuming their kids were there as well, but they're not numbered in the census. All of the people who are numbered in the census, they're going to die in the wilderness. They're not going to go into the land. So these laws in Numbers 15, this is not for the first generation,
Right.
because they're not going into the land. These laws are for the people who go into the land. So it is re-giving the law. This is almost like a glimpse of what Deuteronomy is going to be. Moses is re-giving the law to the new generation. But as he does that, yes, it is, I think, intentional in its placement in the literary structure of the book. I think that's important in the next chapter. So, I just want to keep pressing for now. Bring your first fruits, bring a loaf contribution. Some of the first of your dough you shall give to Yahweh. We've seen all this before. If you sin unintentionally and you don't observe the commandments that Yahweh gave to Moses, and we've seen the sacrifices that you make for unintentional sins in Leviticus 1-7 was all those sacrifices, the grain offering, the drink offering, the sin offering, the peace offering. All of this has been described before. I want to jump to 27-31. I want to read this paragraph here. If one person sins unintentionally, he shall offer a female goat a year old for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement before Yahweh for the person who makes a mistake when he sins unintentionally, to make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he's a native or a sojourner, reviles, or another way to translate reviles is, this is the Hebrew word gadaf or gadaf. It's blaspheme. This person blasphemes Yahweh. And that person shall be cut off from among his people because he has despised the word of Yahweh and has broken his covenant. That people shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be on him.
Is that the unforgivable sin? Is that
Ooh.
blasphemy?
Boy, I think you can't read Matthew 12.
Unforgivable sin.
Mm-hmm. And if you can't come back to the tabernacle and make an offering, you're just cut off. Okay. That's not what the Pharisees did. in Matthew 12. The Pharisees said Jesus was casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul. Is that with a high hand? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Let me say it this way. I think you can't read Matthew 12 outside of the context of this. Can I leave it there? Okay. Fantastic question, and exactly the question that we should be asking. I just am not ready to answer it yet. You need to talk really loud because the mic's way up here.
I don't know if it was asked, but what does it mean, or what does it tell when a person is said to be cut off?
So normally what that means is that they are no longer a part of the people of Israel. They don't get to participate in the congregation. They go live out in another nation now. They're no longer part of Israel. But that's not always what it means, because the next story is important in its own way to understanding what cutoff is.
Is this like the treatment of Cain?
Sort of. Yeah, sort of like Cain.
Sort of like go away?
Yeah, kind of that same idea. Okay, so that's the law that we just read. Now, we're going to step back away from the legal code and step back into the narrative. Keep in mind the last law we just read.
Can you also just speak briefly on what this high hand means?
Yes, and I'm going to do that through the next paragraph.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So, if any person does anything with a high hand, he's going to be cut off, whether he's a native or a sojourner, whether he's Jewish or Gentile, he's cut off. Okay. Now we get to a really challenging passage, especially if we take it out of the context of the last paragraph that we just read. So, in the context of someone doing something with a high hand and being cut off, it says, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. Okay, so good guy, bad guy. No opinion?
It's a hard issue.
He's what?
It's a hard issue.
It's a hard issue. What? Okay. Let's take ourselves out of our 21st century context where gathering sticks isn't an activity that we do all the time. Why would someone in ancient Israel living in the wilderness be gathering sticks?
For a fire.
To warm themselves up. To cook. Okay.
It's the Sabbath.
But it's the Sabbath.
Allowed to.
What are they supposed to be eating on the Sabbath?
They made the day before.
The manna that they gathered the day before. Okay. So this guy is out there gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Man. I'm just going to skip that. Okay.
Well, John,
Yeah.
could that have been a man who was cut off? Or no, they wouldn't have brought him in to stone him.
Yeah, there you go. So no, couldn't have been. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to the congregation, and they put him in custody because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. And Yahweh said to Moses, the man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp, and all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as Yahweh commanded Moses. Okay,
I just have a thought on that.
go ahead.
So these people are going to wander for 40 years, and we know they're not obeying the law, they're not offering sacrifices, they're not circumcising their sons. And so they all of a sudden get holy with this one guy picking up sticks. You see
Oh man.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They're living
Seems
such
a little harsh.
dissipated life. All of them,
Right.
but they center on this one guy.
Yeah.
That's what is so strange.
That's, I was
It's
thinking
the
of
escape
Jesus
stick.
with, he who is without sin cast the first stone.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Like they were really being observant.
Right. Yeah. No, of course they were. Yeah. So, I think David, you're on a good track here, but I want to adjust just a little bit. Instead of thinking about why are the people focusing on this one dude, I want to ask, why is the narrative focusing on this one sin? So I want to change your question just a little bit. Why is Sabbath, seemingly, based on this passage, so much more important than all the other laws that all the other people are breaking every day? Something is special about Sabbath. They're not trusting the Lord. Okay, so I do want to get into this then. Okay, here's a little, I'm going to preach for just like 3 seconds here. God can do more in your life in 6 days than you can do in 7. Okay? So, it's a trust issue. If you, I'm going to say you, but I'm talking about this guy. If you feel like you have to work on the 7th day, then you feel like God is not providing for you on the 7th day. That's what's going on here with the Sabbath. And additionally, remember that the Sabbath, think in terms of covenants. Remember we had the Noahic covenant in Genesis 9, we had the Abrahamic in Genesis 12, we have the Mosaic that was in Exodus with Moses throwing the blood, but really all the time at Mount Sinai, the giving of the laws, really part of the Mosaic covenant. We're going to be talking about the Levitical covenant next week with when Phineas, stabs the dude and the lady. All of these covenants, remember what the elements of a covenant are? You have the sides that are involved in the covenant, and then you have the sign of the covenant. With the Noahic covenant, you had the rainbow. With the Abrahamic covenant, you had the circumcision. The Mosaic covenant, the Sabbath, is the sign of the covenant. So, it's a special law in a way that other laws, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. It's unique because it's the sign of the covenant. So to break the Sabbath is a little bit more than just breaking any other law. And of course, breaking any other law is still bad, right? Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, we talked about blessing for obedience and cursing for disobedience. But to break the sign of the covenant, remember when Moses was going back to Egypt and his wife stopped him and circumcised his son and threw the foreskin at him. Like, it was this crazy, weird story because it's so important that the sign of the covenant be maintained. Okay.
So with that said, how does David get a pass?
David.
Gathering the grains.
Oh, yeah, you got to read that one in the context of what Jesus says about it. Good question, though.
But I'm just saying, just staying in the Old Testament, we're again confronted with a man who is providing for himself on the Sabbath.
So, look at it. I'm going to give you some food for thought. I'm not going to answer your question. Saul is taken out of being king because he failed to wait for Samuel and made sacrifices himself. He took on the role of a priest. David, when running for his life, needed food, went to the temple. It was the temple at the time. No, Solomon built the temple. Went to the tabernacle and got bread from the tabernacle, but only the priests were supposed to eat bread. So he also took on the role of a priest, but didn't face the same punishment as Saul. So there's some difference between who Saul was and who David was in light of who God is that I think will lend itself to answering your question.
Okay. Man, I forgot hard, I guess.
How are we doing?
I didn't make this too simple, but as you're saying how important it was not to break the sign of the covenant itself, it's not the people decide to stone this guy.
God.
It's God that decides.
Totally.
This guy.
Yeah, totally right.
Condemnation. So that shows how important it is to God.
Yeah, this wasn't a Moses decision. Yeah, great point. Great point. Okay. What's the next section? Look at the title of the next section. Tassels on the garments. So we're stepping back out of narrative and back into legal code, and we're dealing with the holiness of the priestly garments. Immediately after they stoned this guy for breaking the Sabbath, something about how Moses has structured this book for our understanding, he thinks we need to go and talk about priests again. So, speak to the people of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the corner of their garments throughout their generations, and put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner, and it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord. So why has this been placed here?
Just because that guy forgot.
Because that guy forgot the commandments. So here we are rereading something that before really only applied to the Levitical garments that they would wear in the service of the temple. Now God says all the Israelites need to have tassels on their garments because apparently the priests having them isn't good enough. So we got to put them on everyone's garment so that people stop forgetting. Sometimes the ESV just isn't really PG. Not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you're inclined to whore after. You shall remember to do all my commandments. I am Yahweh, your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your Elohim. I am Yahweh, your Elohim. So they could have any Elohim, right? They could have lots of Egyptian Elohims or Canaanite Elohim or whatever they want to have, but Yahweh wants to be their Elohim. So remember that distinction and how Hebrew people think about the spiritual realm, or else that just doesn't make sense. Okay. We're going to keep on trucking.
I still have an issue with just the general people. Could you go back to Acts 7:42? And it says, they offered victims and sacrifices for 40 years in the wilderness, but it wasn't to God.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't see, so why was God just singling out this guy when the whole group, he should have just said, Moses, we're going to order up a new group for you. They're going to go 40 years and not sacrifice for him, but they're going to sacrifice to other gods. So that's what I'm wondering about there.
I want to latch on to something you just said.
Okay.
You said God should have just said to Moses, we're going to Control-Alt-Delete this group, and we're going to just order up a new one. That's what he said to Moses. That's exactly what he said.
I'm saying, why doesn't he just repeat it? It says, what we talked about 2 weeks ago, we need to do that again.
He's gonna in the next chapter.
Right.
And why didn't he do it before? Because Moses interceded. And in the next chapter, can you guess what's going to happen? Moses is going to intercede again. So it seems like Moses really wants this rebellious people to stick around.
Well, doesn't it also indicate that the people need an intercessor, which Jesus will
there you go.
Will become. Exactly.
I just wanted to get something. What was the scripture reference again?
This was Acts 7:42. It's also in Amos 5:25.
Thank you.
Same thing.
So, I actually wrote this question down. I was going to ask you after class that Moses, when he intercedes, he's basically in the story. He's acting exactly as Jesus would, almost as a part of God, because God's not changing his mind. It's like Jesus and God are one thing. So
Right.
Moses has this connection with God that is much like Jesus, and so it's like a discussion back and forth. It's not really changing their minds, but later on, when the New Testament comes around, when you look back on it, you realize that this is exactly the position that Jesus plays
Yes.
for us.
And let me just build on that by looking just at a slightly different angle. These people, as David is pointing out, they deserve to die, right? They all deserve what the guy picking up sticks got.
Yeah.
And we also
Yes.
deserve what the guy picking up sticks got.
But Jesus interceded for us the way Moses interceded.
The way Moses
for them.
interceded for them. And that is biblical parallelism. You nailed it.
So I know that I was sick last class, but I listened to the recording, and I'm confused. Where does it say that they weren't making, I had no idea in this part of Numbers that they were not making sacrifices, I know that there were certain instances of them not obeying, but that's like 40, we all know that there was all these different, but nobody was sacrificing. Moses wasn't doing it, is that the case? Moses just let them not sacrifice?
I think you misheard. Acts 7:42 says they were making sacrifices to other gods.
Okay, so I did hear that.
Yeah.
But I also heard him when he first said that no one was making sacrifices. So, do we know that because of Acts? Or was it somewhere in the text that I missed?
It's not in the text in Numbers.
So how do we know that they were not making sacrifices and
Look at
following?
Amos 5:25.
I'll look up Amos 5:25.
I think that's where I got it.
Number 16 is where we're
I have
at.
the weird translation.
Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? That's more of a question than a statement.
Yeah, right.
I'd have to read the context around it to know whether it's rhetorical or not, and I don't want to spend the time.
Saying, no, you didn't.
So my question to that is, let's say they were making sacrifices to other gods.
Yep.
I can't imagine that the only instance that Moses wanted to spotlight was this gentleman picking up sticks on the Sabbath. There was, so do you remember when they made the calf, right?
Yep.
Like that was like, boom, highlighted. Are we saying that there was tons of people, like maybe tons of people, the congregation offering sacrifices outside of the camp to other gods? Is that what we believe? This seemed like, or I'll just say that my understanding of this particular time was that they would have these stupid, grumbling, whiny, bratty instances of not trusting the Lord.
Yep.
But I never knew that they had like how they acted in, was it Kings or Judges, where everybody did what was right in their own eyes?
Judges.
So I didn't think we were at the state of Judges yet.
It's
With these guys.
right there, when they took the censers and put incense on them, is that like, different sacrifices? Like, were they the sons of Korah? When they were,
Well, that's what Yahweh told them to do, right? Or Moses told them to do, or someone, was to take the censers, and that was part of the testing process of the Korah rebellion. I'm not totally 100% sure if this is going to fully answer your question.
Okay.
Numbers, I don't think, is meant to be a all-inclusive story of every rebellion of every person in Israel, right? I think there are stories selected from the events to show the depth of rebellion.
Okay.
And I think that these two that sit side by side, a guy picking up sticks on the Sabbath and Korah's rebellion, are really important ones. And I think that Korah's rebellion is worse. But the fact that the Sabbath one is placed right next to it tells me that I'm probably wrong about that. And my first instinct might actually, that Korah's rebellion is worse, might actually be putting less importance on the Sabbath than what Moses is trying to convey to us. So it's a selection of stories. I think that we have a lot of information we don't have about all of the things that the people of Israel were doing at the time. Yeah.
Sorry, Korah's rebellion was against Moses, where the man picking up sticks was rebelling against God himself, is one issue.
I think I'm going to disagree with that.
You think Korah's was against God?
I think it was.
We'll find out.
I think specifically against Moses, certainly,
Right.
but
Because he was basically saying, who made you leader?
yes,
Why do you get to tell us what to do? We don't like you, Moses.
but God did.
Right.
So the rebellion is against also the person who made him leader.
I'm open to argue.
Okay, me
now-
too.
Now also, at what point did they start eating manna, and does that mean they were out of animals at that point?
Exodus 13?
Okay, what about here in Numbers? Right? Can they be sacrificing if they have no flocks?
That's a good question. Manna does come up in Numbers. We hit it last week, and I think it's placed where it is to bring out the development of the chiastic structure between Numbers and Exodus. I never thought to ask the question of when they ran out of animals, so I don't have an
Yeah,
answer.
because they were complaining, we don't have meat to eat,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well,
Maybe they
have
just wanted
birds
to
and
quit. Well,
flocks.
when they complained they didn't have meat to eat, they were specifically mentioning fish. And then God brought quail, which is weird. So,
Well, fish had been.
I think the difference to your point, why the Sabbath is more important. God is not, breaking the covenant is different than breaking the law. There really isn't, there's not like, there's not a forgiveness there. When you take a look at the laws that are forgiven, none of that is making atonement for breaking the covenant. It makes atonement for breaking these other laws. So breaking the covenant is, and in American culture, we just don't understand what the importance of the covenant really is.
Yeah.
And how different that is from everything.
Now, I'm going to push back just a little bit, because I think that Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 talk about the laws themselves as the covenant, and the breaking of the covenant is not keeping any of the laws. So I do, at least in my mind, the way I think about it, I would equate breaking the law to breaking the covenant. But I'm thinking that the Sabbath is more than just another law in the covenant, but is itself a sign of the covenant. And so it stands apart from the other laws, I think is how I'm thinking about it. Yeah, okay. Ready to push on? No, we're ending with Numbers 19 tonight, and I will not let us leave until we do. So y'all are taking y'all's time. So, all right. So Korah's rebellion. Korah, who was the son of Izhar, the son of who? Kohath. What was his job?
Carrying the holy.
He was a Kohathite, right? And the Kohathites were one of the 3 divisions of the Levites, and his job as part of Israel was to take the Ark of the Covenant and the other holy things and put them on his shoulder. Did he serve in the tabernacle?
Yes, he did.
His whole role was serving in the tabernacle. And then these 2 other guys, Dathan and Abiram, who were sons of Reuben, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben. So you have this guy Korah, who was a Kohathite, and then you have a bunch of these guys who were Reubenites. Remember the defiling of Dinah in Genesis 38? Who told the city of Shechem to get circumcised? Simeon and Levi. Go back 4 more chapters to Genesis, I want to say 34. I hope I'm getting the reference right. What did Reuben do? Because Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob.
Well, he slept with
his dad's concubine on his dad's couch. So when Jacob is giving the blessing over the 12 tribes of Israel, he says to Reuben, because you slept with my concubine, you don't get the firstborn inheritance. Then he goes to the secondborn, Simeon, and thirdborn, Levi, and he says, because you guys did this thing in Shechem, the firstborn inheritance is not coming to you either until you get down to Judah, who was the fourthborn.
He said they were going to be scattered.
He said they were going to be scattered. That Simeon and Levi were going to be scattered. But then not Reuben, but no. Reuben also lost that firstborn inheritance. Right. So I want to put these 2 groups, Levi and Reuben, in a category together. And these are the same people who are in that category of the unrepentant sin, because remember, Judah also did the whole thing with Tamar, right? So he also had a whole bunch of sin going on, but what did he do different than Reuben and Simeon and Levi? He recognized his sin, and he restored, if I can say it that way, restored Tamar, if I can say it that way, okay. That's something that Reuben, Simeon, and Levi don't do. And so I think of them in their own category. So these guys from Levi and Reuben, they rise before Moses with a number of the people of Israel. So they have gathered like a small army to a coup. 250 chiefs of the congregation chosen from the assembly, well-known men, they assembled themselves together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and Yahweh is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of Yahweh? And Moses heard it. When Moses heard it, he fell on his face, and he said to Korah and all his company, in the morning, Yahweh will show who is his and who is holy, and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near him. Do this. Take censers, Korah and all his company, put fire in them and put incense on them before Yahweh tomorrow, and the man whom Yahweh chooses will be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi. So, Moses, you've gone too far. No, you guys have gone too far. So Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of Yahweh, and to stand before the congregation and to minister to them, that he has brought you near to them and all your brothers, the sons of Levi with you? Would you seek the priesthood also?" So Moses is pointing out what we just pointed out. This guy's a Kohathite. His whole role is to serve in the tabernacle, and he's mad that he doesn't get to do the things that Aaron gets to do. Or that Moses, I guess, gets to speak with God face to face. What is Aaron, Moses says, that you grumble against him? Okay, I'm gonna jump ahead here, all the way down to 20. So everyone's assembled. The glory of Yahweh appears to all the congregation. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." So what's God's plan? I'm going to kill Israel, control all the league. I'm going to kill Israel, and I'm going to make, like you said before, basically I'm going to make a new nation out of Moses. Okay, so separate yourself from them. And they fell on their faces and said, "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation?" And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." So the punishment was going to be on the whole congregation. And then Moses intercedes, just like he always does. And he says, "Okay, to tell the congregation to get away from the houses of these three guys." So the congregation, for the second time tonight, is saved by the intercession of Moses. Then Moses rose, he goes to these guys' houses, and let me jump down again. As soon as he had finished speaking, verse 31, all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went alive into Sheol. This is most commonly translated to grave. Sheol is a Hebrew word that the ESV decided not to translate. And the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. And all Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, "Lest the earth swallow us up." And fire came out from Yahweh and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. Where have we seen that before?
Strange fire.
Strange fire. It's Nadab and Abihu again.
I was going to say, wouldn't they think twice when Moses said, "Go ahead and grab some incense and bring it here to the tabernacle"?
You would hope they would. Clearly they didn't. Okay. Go ahead.
Question. So Moses told them to burn this incense,
Mm-hmm.
and they did it
Mm-hmm. And then God burned them.
for burning the incense that Moses told them to do.
Well, these were the 250 who were following Korah in the rebellion.
So that was really the reason why.
Yes.
Okay.
But the burning of the incense and the burning of them holding the incense, I think creates nice poetic imagery.
It's like a little litmus test. When
Yeah.
he was asked to burn, when Moses said burn the incense, by burning the incense, they were basically siding with Korah.
Yes.
And so that was the signal to God that I'm with Korah, not with you.
Oh, interesting point. So kind of the opposite of the Levites in Exodus 32
Yeah.
then. That's an interesting point. I like that. Want to keep going?
Go.
Okay, 41. But on the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron. Guys, this is happening again.
Dumb and dumber.
Saying, "You have killed the people of Yahweh." And when the congregation assembled against Moses and Aaron, they turned toward the tent of meeting, and behold, here comes Yahweh. The cloud covered it, and the kavod of Yahweh appeared, and Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and Yahweh said to Moses, "Get away from the midst of the congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." I would ask, where have we seen that before? But it was 10 verses ago, so we don't really need to ask it. And they fell on their faces, and Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put fire on it from the altar, and lay incense on it, and carry it quickly to the congregation, and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from Yahweh, the plague has begun." So Aaron took it, as Moses said, and ran into the midst of the assembly, and behold, the plague had already begun among the people. This is like a great movie, the way that this is written. Aaron, he's running into the people, and he gets there, and he's got the fire, and he's got the censer, and he looks around, and everyone's dying. And the plague had already begun, and he put on the incense and made atonement for the people, and he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. And those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the affair of Korah. And Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting when the plague was stopped. So wrath. I want to talk about wrath for a minute. Is that okay?
Yeah.
It's the Hebrew word ketsef. 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 It first shows up in something that we read at the beginning of Numbers. It's Numbers chapter 1, verse 53. It says, the Levites, this is describing how the camp of Israel would be set up. It says, the Levites are going to camp around the tabernacle so that there may be no wrath on the congregation of the people of Israel. That's the first time in Scripture that the word ketsef appears. The Levites keeping guard over the tabernacle and over the testimony was the thing that kept the wrath of God from going on the people. So why does the wrath of God strike the people in Numbers, what chapter are we in? 16. It's because, the Levites aren't surrounding the tabernacle. I think the people are trying to subvert the Levites. Korah did it to Aaron. You've gone too far. We're all holy. But you can't, the Levites have to keep the people from the holy things. So thinking you're holy and you can walk in, the wrath of God is on you because you have attempted to enter the presence of God without atonement. You've lost your covering and the wrath hits you. Right? So, I want to talk about Revelation, but I don't have time.
Oh, go ahead.
But I have to talk about Numbers 19. So,
We'll stay off different Revelation.
okay. So 17. Number 17. So more testing, more narrative is happening. So a whole bunch of people just died in a plague because the wrath of God went out, and the thing that stopped the wrath of God was the priest standing in the midst of the people with incense. So in 2 Thessalonians 2, there's this man of lawlessness, and he will not be revealed until the thing that's keeping him from being revealed is taken out of the way. Right? So what was the thing in number 16 that assuaged the wrath of God? It was the priest standing in the midst of the people with the incense. And in Revelation, it says that the incense represents the prayers of the saints. So, what is the thing that is restraining the man of lawlessness, who we understand to be the Antichrist of Revelation, who's going to bring about the wrath of God and the bowls of wrath in the second 3.5 years?
Well, the Holy Spirit.
So, who's the priest today? The church. I wonder if I am thinking too highly of myself to presume that I am the thing restraining the man of lawlessness.
You're a priest on the
If
order
that's
of Melchizedek.
if that's a prideful interpretation of Scripture. But if it is the priest that restrains the wrath, then doesn't it make sense that it is the kingdom of priests and holy nation that 2 Peter refers to the church as, that is restraining the wrath of God from coming onto the world?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're a priest under the order of Melchizedek.
I like having you in class, Bob, because you're just like, yeah, we agree, keep going.
Yeah.
Worse than any of the other priests in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. 17. Okay, so the staffs, if you were following along in the email chain, and by the way, if you're new to class and you're not on the email chain, give me your email tonight, because there's great information getting passed around and great conversation being had. Make sure that you're a part of that. If you were on that, there was a great question posed by Michelle today, that there were 12 staffs but there's 13 tribes. We talked about in verse 6, they took the 12 staffs and they put them in before the presence of God, and then Aaron's staff was among them. So the way that I understand that is there were actually 13. Aaron's was the 13th, which means that the Levites were not part of the 12. And doesn't that fit in with Genesis 49 and the prophecy of Jacob over Levi being split in people? Yeah, there you go. So they leave these staffs in the presence of Yahweh overnight, and then the next day Moses goes in, and the staff of Aaron from the house of Levi had sprouted, buds, and produced blossoms, and Moses brought out all the staffs from before Yahweh, and each person looked at his staff, and I guess they were disappointed, and they took the staff of Aaron and they put it back in the testimony to be kept as a sign for the rebels. It says that you may make an end of their grumblings against me, lest they die. So God's like, if this keeps happening, I'm eventually going to stop letting you intercede for them. If they keep grumbling, they're going to die. Okay. So Moses did as Yahweh commanded him. So he did. What did I just click on? Okay. And the people of Israel said to Moses, behold, we perish. We are undone. We are all undone. Everyone who comes near to the tabernacle of Yahweh shall die. Are we all to perish? And the answer is, not if the priests are surrounding the tabernacle to keep the wrath of God from going on the people. And so you get to chapter 18, which gives us, again, a copy and paste out of Leviticus. It's as if Moses is presenting the story saying, are we all going to die because none of us can approach the presence of God? And Moses is like, no, stupid, because there's the Levites. I gave you the Levites. You're not all going to die. Here's the Levites. And so he just copies and pastes Leviticus into Numbers 18. And honestly, you don't even really need to read much here because it's all repetitious laws of what the Levites do from Leviticus. You remember the chiastic structure of Leviticus, where on the one side you had the holiness of the Levites, and then you had the rebellion of Nadab and Abihu, and then on the other side you had the laws that the priests would do, all the I'm blanking on the word that I want, the duties. Yeah, the kind of the holiness laws of the priesthood. So basically Numbers 18 is like Leviticus 18 through 20. It's kind of just all picked out of there. And you can look at it like we looked at before. It's sort of a repetition of the law for the second generation in a sense. That's what's going on. Yeah, go ahead.
So, like, the second generation is going to read Leviticus. Like, it's not like they didn't get a chance to read Leviticus, so Moses had to copy and paste all those laws. So, like, you know how we talked about, like, was it like a literary picture? We talked about that before. But was there another reason why he did, like, do you think that he did? Is that a silly question to ask? Like, wasn't it
What?
Wasn't it orally though? They didn't all sit down and read scroll.
No,
Most
right.
couldn't read.
It was oral. So, but when he wrote this, it wasn't. So he knew that the generation, I don't know how, I guess I don't know enough about that to speak, but as far as when he actually wrote it and what generation of Israelites were around at the time that he wrote it. But
I think probably, I'm going to make a probably statement. I think Leviticus and Numbers were probably written on the plains of Moab before the second generation went into the promised land. That is a hotly debated topic among scholars, so I don't want to make a definitive statement or have you take that to the bank.
sure.
Okay, cool. All right, guys, Numbers 19.
Wait.
Oh.
But you have to stop. She's your mom.
What does it mean in verse 19 where it says covenant of salt? What does that mean?
Leviticus 5, I think it was. No, Leviticus 2. Never exclude the salt from any of the offerings that you make at the tabernacle. So great, because you just picked up on a theme that I was going to jump right over. What verse was that?
19. Chapter 18.
Great. It
verse
is a
19.
covenant of salt forever before Yahweh for you and your offspring with you. Remember Leviticus 2 and the grain offering talks about the salt, but then it says, not just with the grain offering, but it says, never let the salt be missing from any of your offerings that you bring to the tabernacle. So salt, and I don't like the terminology of X represents Y. I like to say, where have we seen this before, and how do those things fit together? So if the salt is used in the offerings of Leviticus 2, and if the covenant is referred to as a covenant of salt before Yahweh for you and your offspring with you, then I start to get the picture that salt is associated with the covenant in some sense. Whether salt represents covenant, I don't know if I want to make a big leap like that, but the salt is associated with the covenant. So, when Jesus comes along in the Sermon on the Mount and says, you're the salt of the earth, what do we do with that? If the salt can't be missing from the offerings, and we are the salt, then doesn't that sort of make us the offering of the new covenant? Okay, heresy, because Jesus is the offering of the new covenant, right? Okay, but aren't we to be Christ-like? Aren't we to, let me just pull an example from Ephesians 5, die to ourselves as Christ did for the church, and be associated with the offering in that sense. So I think what's being communicated by Jesus, by being called the salt of the earth, when I back up to Numbers 18, I back up to Leviticus chapter 2, is that we are to be the offering that enacts the new covenant for the world.
Good.
How you doing? Good? Like it? Everyone happy?
Yeah.
Okay. Numbers 19?
Sorry.
Okay, Numbers 19. Laws for purification. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, this is the statute of the law that Yahweh has commanded. Tell the people of Israel to bring you a red heifer. So you might see news, like from Israel, about looking for a red heifer, trying to, why do they want a red heifer? Maybe I'll answer that question for you then. Bring a red heifer without defect, in which there is no blemish, and on which a yoke has never come. And give it to Eleazar, that's one of Aaron's 4 sons, and it shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered before him. And Eleazar shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle his blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. Where have you seen 7 before? Creation. And the heifer shall be burned in his sight. Its skin, its flesh, its blood, its dung, and all shall be burned. The entire thing is burned. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet yarn and throw them into the fire, burning with the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward he may come into the camp. But the priest shall be unclean until evening. Okay, remember on the Hebrew calendar, the day starts at sundown. So that means that he's unclean for the rest of that day. And at the start of the new day, when the sun goes down, then he's clean after he's washed. Okay, the one who burns the heifer shall wash his clothes in water and bathe his body in water and shall be unclean until evening, and a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place. And they shall be kept for the water for impurity for the congregation of the people of Israel. It is a sin offering. And the one who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening, and this shall be a perpetual statute for the people of Israel and for the stranger who sojourns among them. So, well, let's keep going. Whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. 7, to already said creation. That's where we first saw it, at least. He shall cleanse himself with water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Have we ever seen a pattern of 3 and 7?
It also says with the water.
With the water.
Not with water, but with the water.
Yes.
Indicating the water we were just talking about.
Yeah. It's that water.
That water.
But we don't actually know.
They don't use articles.
They do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was the adultery testing too, wasn't it?
What's that?
Wasn't that the adultery testing at 3 and 7 days?
No. No, not the adultery test. I'm thinking of the patterns in Genesis 1. Remember the pattern of 3, God separated the light from darkness, separated the waters from above the expanse with the waters below the expanse, and then separated the waters and to bring out the land. And then he filled the space, the light and dark, with the sun, moon, and stars on day 4. Then he filled the waters above and waters below with birds and fish. Then he filled the land with people and animals. And then you have that special bonus day there where God rests. So you have the pattern of 3 and 7 is all about creation. So if you're going to wash on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, I'm going to make a leap here. Maybe you'll jump with me. The people being washed are becoming a new creation. Guys. Right? Okay.
So they're being separated.
Yeah. Yeah, they're totally being separated and filled, because if you're unclean, you're separated from the camp. Right? Okay. Whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. Where was I? I already read that. 3rd day, 7th day. Okay, verse 13. Whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the tabernacle of Yahweh, and that person is cut off from Israel. Because the water for impurity was not thrown on him, he shall be unclean, his uncleanness is still on him. This is the law when someone dies in a tent. Everyone who comes into the tent and everyone who is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days, and every open vessel that has no cover fastened on it is unclean. Whoever in the open field touches someone who was killed with a sword or who died naturally, or touches a human bone or a grave shall be unclean 7 days. For the unclean they shall take some ashes of the burnt sin offering and fresh water. This word in Hebrew for fresh is the word chai, which means living.
Wow.
So you take living water, okay? Got any New Testament people in here? Got any lights going off in your head? Living water, okay? And you mix it with the ashes, and you wash on the 3rd day and on the 7th day to become a new creation through the sacrifice of a perfect, unblemished, unburdened offering and living water. I can't really be much more clear. Okay. Okay, let me see. The water shall be added in a vessel, that a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water and sprinkle it on the tent and on all the furnishings and on the persons who were there and on whoever touched the bone or the slain or the dead or the grave. And the clean person shall sprinkle it on the unclean on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And on the 7th day he shall cleanse him. He shall wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. And at evening, meaning the start of which day? The 8th day, he shall be clean. Oh, okay. So we have, it's picture time.
Sketch it.
I'm not really going to draw. I'm going to start by writing. So you have the elements of the sacrifice. Number 1 was the red heifer. Number 2 was what? Right there. What was number 2? Cedar wood. What is happening? Number 2. Okay, cedar wood. Number 3. Hyssop. Number 4. Scarlet. Whoops. Scarlet. And then you take these 4 things and burn them all together and mix them with living water. Whoops. Oh, great. Then you take that living water, and on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, a person has to be washed. And the reason for the washing takes you from impurity to purity. Okay. There's another pattern of 3 and 7 in the Bible that we haven't really covered yet. Well, there's a lot more. But I want you to think for a second about the Passion Week of Jesus. So he goes into Jerusalem on Sunday, the 10th day of Nisan. We know that from the record in John's Gospel where he goes to, what's the name of the town? Bethany, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus are, and it tells us what day he was there, and then John does his whole next day thing, which he does a lot. You follow the story and you get to the 10th day, which is Sunday, Palm Sunday we call it, and he enters into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. That's the start of the Passion Week of Jesus. So if Jesus, now the day that Jesus died is debated. Because if he is the fulfillment of the Passover lamb, then he would have been killed on the 14th day of the first month, because that's when the Passover lamb was killed, right? And the Passover lamb, Exodus 12, was brought into the house on the 10th day of the first month, which aligns with Palm Sunday. So they bring the lambs. The whole city of Jerusalem was bringing lambs into their house on the same day that Jesus was riding on a donkey into Jerusalem. The whole city of Jerusalem was slaughtering the lambs in their house on the same day that Jesus was being nailed to a cross. Then Jesus spends 3 days in the grave. If he had died on Thursday, the 14th, in alignment with the Passover, then he would have spent Friday, Saturday, and part of Sunday. Had he died on Friday, which is the traditional understanding, Good Friday we call it, then he would have spent part of Friday and Saturday and Sunday. The timeline doesn't really matter that much, and that's kind of okay with me. It's very debated. Either way, he goes and he spends 3 days in the grave, and then he raises from the grave on Sunday. Well, Sunday is 8 days after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So the point that I want to make here with the lining up the offering for purification with the Passion Week of Jesus is that, okay, let me just go to John chapter 19. You guys are fine with me just like box wide open tonight, right? Yeah. Okay. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. And you can search the whole Old Testament, and you're not going to find a single prophecy that says that Jesus is going to hang on the cross and be thirsty. So what does it mean to fulfill the scripture? Well, look at what happens. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on what kind of branch? A hyssop branch. And they held it up to his mouth. So I have I should have opened this before. I should have had this ready because I knew I was talking about this tonight. Where's my thing? There it is. Crucifixion and hyssop. I don't want an update. Okay. Come back. Okay, so in Numbers 19, you have the red heifer, you have the cedar wood, you have the scarlet yarn, and you have the hyssop. In the sacrifice of Jesus, the red heifer, the equivalent of that is the bloody body of Jesus. Remember, the heifer was killed outside the city. Jesus killed outside the city. The cedar wood you see in the cross. The scarlet yarn you see in the robe that was placed on him when they were mocking him. And then the hyssop shows up in John chapter 19 in the last moments of Jesus' life. So when Jesus says, "It is finished," what's he talking about with the it? Is he saying sin is finished? Is he saying death is finished? Is he saying
that sacrifice?
It seems to me that all of the elements of Numbers 19 have been present in his death except for the hyssop branch. And it's when the hyssop branch shows up that Jesus says it is finished. Okay, so then he bows his head and gives up his spirit. So the thing that was finished when the hyssop branch arrived on the scene, Jesus couldn't die before fulfilling Numbers 19, because what we need is the thing that takes us from impurity to purity.
Right.
Does all that make sense? You tracking with me? You're not nearly as excited as you should be. It's a lot. It's a lot. Okay. We got 10 more minutes. I see people like holding up their phones. I want to make sure I'm not taking something away that you need. So let's go back to Numbers 19. Oh, I don't want to know. Yeah, sorry, I want to draw another picture. I don't need this. If you want a picture, take it now or get it from someone who already took it. Because I'm not going to save this. It's just words. I have enough of those. Okay, so now you can guess what I'm going to draw. What is this?
The tabernacle.
The altar. What's over here? The basin. Holy of Holies and Holy Place. What's down here? The lampstand. Imagine I drew 7 dots there. What's there in the middle? Incense. What's over here? Table. How many pieces of bread? And what's in here? The Ark of the Covenant. And what's over the Ark of the Covenant? Sitting in between the cherubim? The presence of God, the kavod. Okay. In order to establish the tabernacle, all of those articles had to be purified. You remember those stories from Exodus and Leviticus of the washing of all those things. Well, what were those things washed with in order to purify them? They had to be washed with the thing that was used for purification, which you don't get until Numbers 19. But the tabernacle is already set up. So remember I pointed out last week that Numbers doesn't really care too much about its chronological order. It starts in the second month of the second year, and then by the time you get to chapter 9, you're in the first month of the second year. We've already had copy and pasting out of Leviticus in order to draw our minds out of the narrative back to the law and then back to the narrative. So Numbers 19, the priests, when they enter into the holy place, they also have to wash. They also have to be pure when they go in, which means that the water that's in this basin, although it's not explicit, I think it is implicit and pretty sure that that has to be the water from Numbers 19, which means that Numbers 19 is way out of place in the story. Because Numbers 19 had to come along before the construction of the tabernacle, or else they never could have purified all the stuff with the tabernacle, right? Okay, why is Numbers 19 where it is? So think about Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. Why was Leviticus 16 where it was? Because Nadab and Abihu went into the holy place and died. And the people, Moses, had to know how to get the death out of the holy place and to make atonement for it. So what just happened in Numbers? Korah's rebellion, the kid picking up sticks, a whole bunch of death just entered into the camp, and we have to know how to deal with death. Because there are other ways that we can become impure. Leviticus talked all about the impure foods, that you touch an animal that's not pure to eat and you become impure. It talked about contact with bodily fluids, you become impure. It's not just death, but Numbers 19 was only specific to death. So that tells me that even though there's more ways that I can become unclean than just death, Numbers 19 is placed where it is because it's dealing with the death that was just introduced into the camp in the previous chapters. In the same way that Leviticus 16 is dealing with the fact that the tabernacle needed to be atoned from the death that entered into it. So you have this parallel passage here. So why is Numbers 19 apparently taken way out of the place where it belongs? Because it had to be given before the tabernacle could be set up. It's for the purpose of the flow of the story and our understanding of how God is going to deal with death in the camp of Israel. All that makes sense?
Isn't it also the chiastic, like the center of Numbers?
Of Numbers?
Yeah.
Is it? Oh, if it is. She said, isn't Numbers 19 the chiastic center of Numbers? I don't know, but if it is, I want to know.
There's 36 chapters.
Chapters.
So 18 would be dead center physically.
But then,
But
They
they
can
didn't
have
have, they didn't
multiple
actually
Yeah.
have chapters.
yeah, they didn't have chapter breaks, so you have to look at pericopal themes and figure out.
If 20 and 21 start down repeating other things, then we'll know that that's the.
Then we'll know. Yeah. So we'll find out next week. Man, if it is, I have to call some people. Okay. Gosh. How do you get death off? Wash on the third and seventh day, become a new creation. It's the sacrifice of Jesus. Oh, hey, great. Let's talk about the living water. John chapter 8. I am the light of the world, because there was a light ceremony going on in Jerusalem. Is it 8? Or is it 8? No, it's 7. 7. Rivers of living water. Okay. So this is John chapter 7, starting in verse 37. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." The living water is the thing that the ashes are mixed with, right? John gives us an authorial note. He says, "Now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified." So what John is doing is he's setting up the process by Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, glorification, ascension, and then his ascension is Acts chapter 1. The Spirit comes in Acts chapter 2. So at Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, the Spirit descends, tongues of fire, the whole thing, speaking in tongues. It's wild. 3,000 people get saved. Peter preaches a crazy sermon that summarizes the entire Old Testament. That is the living water mixed with the ashes of the sacrifice that brings life out of death and creates a new creation. So you have the work of Jesus, and then the indwelling of the Spirit brings life from death. Totally opened the box. Talked about 100 things outside of numbers tonight. But man, it's so cool, right? Okay. Questions? We got like 3 minutes.
Okay. One is the living water in the Old Testament, that was just water.
It was water that came from a spring or a river or a stream. It had to be moving. It had to have an inlet. It had to have an outlet, so it wasn't stagnant. It couldn't come from a puddle or a well that wasn't part of an underground spring. It had to come from water that was moving.
And the question was in regards to the red heifer. So that was a sacrifice for the congregation.
Everyone, yeah.
Now, so what exactly is the difference between that and all the other sacrifices that were done for the congregation?
This one specifically is for purification. It's not for the removal of sins, because remember that uncleanness, impurity is sin makes you unclean, but not all uncleanness is the result of sin. Someone could just die next to you and fall on you. You become unclean. You didn't sin, but you still can't go to the tabernacle until you're clean. So that is where the red heifer comes in. And I forgot to point something out, and if it's okay with you, it's okay with me if we go a few minutes long. Why are we looking for a red heifer today? Because they're trying to rebuild the temple. And if you need the water to purify all the things, right? If the water goes in the basin so that you can purify all the things that are being used in the temple, then of course they're looking for a red heifer. And as soon as they get one, they're going to burn it. And they're going to mix it with water, and they're going to mix it with this other stuff. And so people have these weird eschatological ideas about what a red heifer will do or will be. I just want to get really simple. They're looking for it because of Numbers 19, because they're trying to rebuild the temple.
So,
Yeah.
Numbers 19 actually was the very first thing they sacrificed. That would be because they couldn't sacrifice anything else until they had
Until the
water.
tabernacle
Well,
was
this
built.
would have been the very first thing.
Oh, what a great point. Wow. Did you guys hear her? She said the red heifer would have been the very first sacrifice in Israel because they couldn't make other sacrifices until the tabernacle was set up. Yeah. What a cool point.
So, so last time when we, because I remember that slide from God Wants to Be.
I've used it a few times.
Yeah, it's amazing. It was amazing or sermon, but I always thought because the other part of that was running or living water. So the fact that they pierced Jesus' side with the sword and out came water.
And the water and blood came out.
Yeah, wasn't that part of that or no?
It could be. It could be, yeah. So I'm taking the living water based on John 7 to be the Spirit. But the piercing of Jesus' side when the water and blood flow out, you could definitely relate that into Numbers 19. Yeah.
Even though the reason I questioned that was because at that point he had already died. So it doesn't matter.
Well, at the point that the living water enters into the ceremony of purification, the red heifer has already died. So,
Okay.
yep, there you go.
Cool.
Problem resolved.
I know. I love that.
That when he offers the living water to the woman at the well, he's referencing this also.
Ooh, I need to think about that more. But I bet I
Because
think
she
yes,
would
but I
know.
need to go read that again before I can say yes for sure.
Because when he said living water to her, she would have already known about Numbers.
Maybe, but she was a Samaritan, so
but-
the question would be how much did she know about the law?
It's just all
Yeah, but-
her salvation.
Right, but she already knew about the Messiah. So, I mean, she knew to expect the Messiah. She knew. We were told he would, well,
Yeah, she didn't know he, talk about her 5 husbands or
No,
so.
she didn't know that, but she knew she knew the
Yeah.
idea of the
Yeah.
Messiah. So,
Yeah,
that's cool, that's good.
awesome. Are we good? Great.
Yeah.
Cool. Who wants to pray tonight? I usually call on someone, but I'm going to ask.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the time that you've given us tonight. Lord, we thank you for the passion that John brings to the study, that it just makes your word come alive and that draws out things that we never would have seen otherwise. And Lord, I just thank you for the completion of your word, that you show so many parallels, that we would just seek it out. So, Father, I pray that we would have that hunger and that drive to seek out the truth in your word and to meditate on it all the time. Father, we love you. It's in your blessed name I pray.